In the heart of Prairie Creek, where wildflowers dance with summer winds, Miss Sarah Bennett's world turned to ash in a single night. For 30 years, she shaped young minds in the weathered schoolhouse, living alone in her modest home, filled with cherished books and memories. Then came the fire that devoured everything, leaving her with nothing but the clothes on her back and a lifetime of memories scattered in the wind. Too proud to accept charity, she makes her bed among the charred remains of the schoolhouse, her only companion, the morning bell that once called her students to class. But fate has different plans. When Jackson Rhodes, the wealthy rancher known for his solitary nature, rides into town with lumber and determination in his eyes, everything changes. Could this rugged cowboy, marked by his own past, be the unexpected answer to her prayers? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Miss Sarah Bennett's fountain pen glided across the weathered pages of her leather-bound teaching journal, the afternoon light streaming through the schoolhouse windows, casting long shadows across her desk. May 15th, 1955. Last day of term, she wrote, her precise handwriting filling the final line of the page. 30 years of memories lived within this journal's pages, each entry a testament to lives touched and lessons learned. She closed the journal with practiced care, running her fingers over the worn leather cover, the brass clasp, polished smooth, from decades of daily use, caught the sunlight and winked at her like an old friend. Sarah had purchased this journal with her first month's teaching salary, determined to document every triumph and challenge of her calling. The empty classroom still hummed with echoes of the day's farewell celebrations. Paper chains and children's artwork adorned the walls, their bright colors a stark contrast to the austere wooden beams above. Little Jenny Miller's crayon drawing of their classroom sat prominently on Sarah's desk, complete with a stick figure, representation of Miss Bennett, standing tall at the blackboard, her grey-streaked hair captured in its familiar bun. Rising from her chair, Sarah began her evening ritual of straightening desks and collecting forgotten items. Tommy Anderson's worn arithmetic book, its corners soft from devoted use, lay beneath his desk. She smiled, remembering how the boy who once declared numbers his mortal enemy had blossomed into the class's most enthusiastic mathematician. Tiwi, setting sun, painted the classroom in amber hues as Sarah methodically cleaned the blackboard, her movements deliberate and reverent. 30 years of lessons, thousands of children, countless moments of discovery and growth, all witnessed by these humble walls. Her hand paused mid-sweep, chalk dust dancing in the golden light. Miss Bennett, a small voice drew her attention. To the doorway, Mary Catherine stood there, clutching a bundle wrapped in gingham cloth. "Mama sent these for you. She said teachers need proper sustenance during summer planning." Sarah set down her eraser and wiped her hands on her apron. "Why?" "Thank you, dear. Your mother's honey biscuits are legendary." She accepted the bundle, breathing in the sweet, familiar scent. "And how are you feeling about moving up to the high school next term?" Mary Catherine's fingers twisted in her dress. "Scared, maybe?" "Everything's going to be different." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I wish you could come teach there, too." Sarah's heart squeezed with familiar tenderness. Reaching into her desk drawer, she withdrew a small volume of poetry, its spine cracked from years of use. Emily Dickinson once wrote, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul. Remember, dear one, every new beginning carries wings of possibility." The girl's eyes brightened as she accepted the book, holding it close to her chest. "Really? I can keep it?" "Books are meant to be companions on life's journey," Sarah replied, smoothing a stray curl from Mary Catherine's forehead. "Just promise me you'll share these words with someone else who needs them someday." After Mary Catherine departed, Sarah resumed her evening tasks, preserving this moment in her memory like pressing a flower between pages. The familiar creak of floorboards beneath her feet, the lingering scent of chalk dust and beeswax, the way shadows lengthened across the worn planks, all of it precious, All of it ordinary, all of it home. She had no way of knowing that by morning, these treasured routines would exist only in memory. No way to predict that the small spark in old Mrs. Henderson's kitchen, 3 houses down, would grow into an inferno that would devour half the town. No reason to suspect that this ordinary evening of tidying and reflection would be the last time she stood in her classroom as she had known it for 3 decades. Sarah's final act was to wind the brass school bell that had faithfully marked time for generations of students. Its clear tone rang out across the emptying street, a sound as much a part of Prairie Creek as the wind in the cottonwoods or the distant lowing of cattle. Tomorrow would bring what it would, but tonight, in the gentle embrace of dusk, Miss Sarah Bennett was exactly where she belonged. She gathered her journal and Mary Catherine's gift, tucking them into her worn leather satchel. At the doorway, she paused, one hand resting on the smooth wooden frame. "Good night, old friend," she whispered. "To the quiet room, a habit of 30 years. See you in September." The screams woke her first, raw, desperate sounds that ripped through the quiet prairie night. Sarah fumbled for her father's gold pocket watch on the bedside table, its hands catching moonlight. 2:17 a.m. Then came the acrid smell, and her world shifted forever. Orange light flickered through her bedroom window, too bright, too alive for the middle of the night. The air grew thick with smoke as she stumbled to her feet, fingers clutching her cotton nightgown. Outside, voices rose. In panic, a terrible chorus accompanied by the savage roar of flames. "Fire! Dear God, it's spreading!" The cry came from the street, followed by the frantic clanging of the town's emergency bell. Sarah grabbed her teaching journal and the family Bible, hands trembling as she shoved them into her satchel. The heat was building now, pressing against her windows like a living thing. Her father's watch slipped into her pocket, its weight against her hip oddly reassuring. The front door handle burned her palm when she tried it. Coughing, she retreated to the kitchen, where flames already licked at the rear wall. Her precious books lined the shelves, spines gleaming in the hellish light. 30 years of collecting, of saving pennies from her teacher's salary. First, editions of Thoreau, Whitman, Dickens, each one a friend, each one about to become ash. "Miss Bennett," Sheriff Wade's voice boomed through the smoke. "Get out now!" She reached for one last volume, her mother's copy of Jane Eyre, but a burning beam crashed down behind her, sending sparks cascading through the kitchen. The heat drove her back, forcing her toward the door as her home groaned and crackled. Around her, strong hands grabbed her shoulders, pulling her into the street. She stumbled, gasping in the cool night air, watching helplessly as flames devoured her life's collection. The sheriff's wife wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, but Sarah barely felt it. The fire spread with terrifying speed, jumping from building to building, despite the bucket brigade's desperate efforts. Mrs. Henderson sobbed nearby, repeating, "I'm sorry," over and over. A pot of soup left too long on the stove, they would later learn. But now, there was only chaos, heat and loss. Sarah stood rooted, clutching her satchel, as her neighbors fought to save what they could. The schoolhouse caught next, its weathered wood offering little resistance. The bell tower became a torch against the night sky, and when the rope burned through, the bell gave one final mournful toll before crashing down. Dawn broke over a changed world. Where Sarah's home had stood for 3 decades, only smoking rubble remained. The schoolhouse was a blackened skeleton, its windows gaping like hollow eyes. Her father's watch, rescued from the inferno, had stopped at 3:42 a.m., the moment her old life ended. "You'll stay with us, of course," Mrs. Wade said, her hand gentle on Sarah's arm. "We have plenty of room," but Sarah couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her eyes fixed on the remains of her home, where pages of burned books fluttered like wounded birds in the morning breeze. Everything she owned, everything she'd built, everything she was, reduced to cinders and memory. She fingered the watch in her pocket, thumb tracing its smooth surface as she had done countless times watching students puzzle over arithmetic problems or struggle with difficult words. The glass was cracked now, the hands frozen in time, but it was something. Something saved. Something to hold on to. As the sun climbed higher, neighbors began picking through the ruins, calling out when they found anything salvageable. But Sarah knew better. What she'd lost couldn't be recovered from ashes. Not the marginal notes in her beloved books, not the pressed flower from her first day of teaching, not the carefully preserved letters from former students. She opened her satchel, drawing out the teaching journal and Bible, all that remained of her possessions. The journal's leather cover was scorched at the edges, but its pages still held 30 years of memories, safe within their bindings. She clutched them to her chest and finally allowed herself to weep, her tears falling silently into the ashes of her former life. In the days following the fire, kindness came knocking at doors all over Prairie Creek. Sarah Bennett politely declined each offer, her refusals wrapped in dignity like a threadbare shawl. "I couldn't possibly impose," became her daily litany, spoken with the same firm gentleness she'd once used to correct grammar in her classroom. The charred skeleton of the schoolhouse became her sanctuary. Each night, she laid her borrowed blanket in what remained of her old classroom, positioning herself where her desk had once stood. The stars wheeled overhead through the burned-away roof, and she pretended they were just another lesson in astronomy. "Miss Bennett," Reverend Clark said one morning, finding her straightening her simple belongings with characteristic precision, "the Miller family has a spare room ready. You needn't stay here among the—" He gestured helplessly at the ruins. "Thank you, Reverend, but I'm quite comfortable." She smiled, the same smile she'd given uncertain students before difficult examinations. "Besides, someone needs to mind the school property." He looked around at the blackened timbers, the melted remnants of the school bell half buried in ashes. "The school board's already approved funds for rebuilding, but it will take months. Winter will come before then." Sarah smoothed her soot-stained skirt, one of 3 garments Mrs. Wade had pressed upon her. "I've witnessed 30 winters from this spot. One more won't trouble me." The Reverend shifted uncomfortably. "Pride goeth before destruction," he quoted softly. "And charity begins at home," she countered, her voice gentle but firm. "Your congregation has many families in need after the fire. Please focus your attention there." Each day she maintained what routines she could. Her father's broken pocket watch still marked 3:42, but she consulted it regularly, preserving the rhythms of her former life. At precisely 8 o'clock she stood where the school bell had hung and called out, "Good morning, children," to the empty air. The townspeople watched with growing concern as she swept ash from phantom floors and arranged salvaged bricks into neat rows for imaginary lessons. Some whispered about grief turning her mind. Others remembered how she'd nursed their children through illness, taught their families to read, served their community for 3 decades without complaint. "Just temporary," they assured each other in hushed voices at the general store, "until she comes to her senses." But Sarah had her reasons, buried deep beneath her pride. In the quiet of night, she opened her scorched teaching journal and added new entries by moonlight. "Today I learned," she wrote, "that 4 walls and a roof don't make a home. Today I learned that everything essential fits in a single satchel. Today I learned—" She couldn't bring herself to write what she'd really learned, that accepting help meant accepting change, and change meant acknowledging that her old life was truly gone. Better to sleep among familiar ruins than in a stranger's spare room where everything would remind her of what she'd lost. One morning, Mary Catherine crept through the ruins, clutching the poetry book Sarah had given her. "Miss Bennett, I brought your book back." "Books aren't meant to be returned, dear one," Sarah replied, though the sight of the volume made her heart ache. "They're meant to be passed forward, but you've lost all of yours." The girl's voice cracked. "It isn't fair." Sarah drew herself up, shoulders straight as if facing her classroom. "Life rarely concerns itself with fairness. What matters is how we face our challenges." The words tasted of ash in her mouth, but she forced a smile. "Now, shouldn't you be heading to the high school?" After Mary Catherine left, Sarah retrieved her Bible from its careful wrapping. The leather cover was singed, its pages smoke-stained, but it opened naturally to her mother's favorite passage. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Want, she thought, tracing the familiar words. Such a simple word for such a complicated feeling. She didn't want charity or pity. She didn't want to be another burden on her struggling neighbors. Most of all, she didn't want to admit that her carefully ordered world had crumbled to ash and dirt beneath her feet. Pride, she knew, was a sin, but sometimes pride was all that kept you standing when everything else fell away. The stranger arrived at dawn, when the prairie grass sparkled with dew and long shadows stretched across the ruins of Prairie Creek. Sarah was already awake. Sleep came fitfully these days, when she heard the steady clip-clop of hooves against packed earth. Through the remnants of the schoolhouse wall, she watched a man dismount from a tall bay horse. Everything about him spoke of solitude, from his weathered Stetson pulled low over his eyes to the way he moved with the self-contained efficiency of someone long accustomed to working alone. His saddlebags were heavy, with something that clinked metallically as he tied his horse to a remaining fence post. From where she sat, Sarah could see the edge of what looked like papers rolled carefully in oilcloth, protruding from one bag. The man stood for a long moment, studying the burned-out schoolhouse with the careful eye of someone who understood. Broken things. Sarah smoothed her wrinkled skirt and adjusted her hair, vanity surviving even here among the ashes. She knew every face in Prairie Creek, but this man was a stranger, yet something in his stance seemed familiar. Perhaps the way he held himself, straight-backed but not rigid, like a tree that had weathered many storms. "Good morning," she called out, her teacher's voice carrying clearly across the quiet yard. "I'm afraid school's not in session at the moment." He turned, and she saw his face properly for the first time, weathered like his hat, lined with experience rather than just age, with eyes that reminded her of autumn skies. A thin scar traced his jaw, silver white against tanned skin. "Ma'am?" He touched the brim of his hat. His voice was low and gravelled, as if he didn't use it often. "Jackson Rhodes bought the old Mitchell place last spring." Ah, Sarah thought. The reclusive rancher who'd purchased the largest spread in the county. There had been talk, of course. There always was in small towns. But he'd kept to himself, appearing in town only for supplies and necessary business. "Miss Sarah Bennett," she replied, though he likely already knew. Everyone knew about the stubborn schoolteacher sleeping in ruins. "What brings you to my temporary accommodation?" Something flickered in those autumn sky eyes. Not pity, thank heavens, but something more complex. Understanding, perhaps. He reached into his saddlebag and withdrew the rolled papers. "Brought these," he said, approaching with unhurried steps. "Thought they might interest you. They were architectural drawings, done with the precise hand of someone who understood both buildings and beauty. A house, modest but well-designed, with a small front porch and built-in bookshelves along one wall. In the margins were careful notes about lumber requirements and foundation specifications. "Mr. Rhodes," she began, her voice tight. "I appreciate the thought, but I'm not accepting, not offering charity." He interrupted quietly but firmly. "Offering fair trade. Been meaning to learn my letters proper. Figure you might be willing to teach in exchange for honest work." Sarah studied him more carefully. His hands, she noticed, were calloused from labor, but steady enough to draw these precise plans. There was intelligence in his face, and something else, a familiar stubbornness that matched her own. "You can read," she said. It wasn't a question. The annotations on his drawings were too specific, too technical for someone illiterate. A slight smile touched his lips. "Well enough for ranching, not well enough for poetry. Heard you're the best teacher in 3 counties. "I was," she corrected, glancing at the ruins around them. "Still are," he countered. "Building's just a building. Teaching's in the person." The morning sun had risen higher, burning away the dew. In the distance, a meadowlark began its morning song. Sarah looked again at the drawings, seeing not just the clean lines and careful measurements, but the thought behind them. The bookshelves, the south-facing windows, perfect for reading by natural light, the small study tucked away at the back. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why go to all this trouble for a stranger?" Jackson Rhodes was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant. "Had a teacher once," he said finally. "Taught me enough to dream bigger than my circumstances. Figure I owe that. Debt forward." He didn't mention the rumors about her mental state or the concerned whispers of the townspeople, didn't offer pity or charity or well-meant platitudes. Just stood there, patient as the prairie itself, offering a trade of value for value. Sarah looked down at the drawings again, her fingers tracing the careful lines. "I'm a demanding teacher, Mr. Rhodes." That slight smile returned. "Yes, ma'am, counting on it." The sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Jackson Rhodes returned the next morning, his wagon loaded with lumber and tools. Sarah was already awake, her father's broken pocket watch in hand, when she heard the creak of wooden wheels. "You're early, Mr. Rhodes," she called out, emerging from the schoolhouse ruins with as much dignity as her circumstances allowed. Her grey-streaked hair was neatly pinned, her borrowed dress pressed despite its night among the ashes. "Sun's burning." "Daylight," he replied, already unloading supplies with methodical efficiency. Each piece of lumber was carefully sorted, each tool laid out with purpose. Sarah recognized the actions of a man who'd learned to rely on order and routine, much like herself. "Our agreement was for afternoon lessons," she reminded him, watching as he began clearing debris from what remained of her home's foundation. "After your ranch work." Jackson paused, wiping his brow with a bandana. "Ranch hands can handle the morning duties. This needs doing first." He gestured to the sky. "Storm coming in a few days. Need to get the foundation set before it hits." Sarah followed his gaze to the cloudless blue expanse above. "The weather looks perfectly fine to me. Left knee says different." He returned to his work, adding quietly, "Never been wrong yet." She watched him dig, his movements economical and practiced. The morning light caught the silver threading through his dark hair, and she noticed how he favored his right side slightly. "Old injuries carrying their own weather predictions. At least let me help," she offered, reaching for a shovel. "You can." He nodded toward a flat stump where he'd laid out his architectural drawings. "Tell me about these books we'll be reading. Give me something to think on while I work." So Sarah found herself conducting her first lesson there in the early morning light, discussing literature while Jackson's shovel bit into the earth. She spoke of Dickens and Twain, of poetry and prose, watching how he listened intently even as he worked. "Call me Ishmael," she quoted, testing him. "The opening line of Moby Dick," he answered without looking up. "Tried reading it once. Got lost in all them whale parts." "Perhaps we'll try it again together," she said, surprised by his knowledge and more surprised by her own desire to share these literary journeys with him. "Though we might start with something more accessible." The morning wore on, and Sarah found herself drawn into the rhythm of construction. She began pointing out where things had stood in her old home: the kitchen window, where morning light had warmed her breakfast table, the corner where her reading chair had sat. Jackson listened, occasionally asking practical questions about heights and angles, incorporating her memories into his plans. When Mrs. Wade brought them both lunch, bread and cheese and fresh apple pie, Sarah realized she'd spent hours talking without once thinking about her losses. "You have ink on your hands," Jackson observed as they ate, sitting on newly delivered lumber. Sarah glanced down at her fingers, chronically stained from years of grading papers. "Occupational hazard of teaching," she replied, "just as your calluses. Speak of your work," he nodded, studying his own weathered hands. "Different kinds of building, I suppose. You build minds, I build structures. Both require proper foundation," she said, watching him sketch a small adjustment to his plans. "Speaking of which, your penmanship could use work." A slight smile crossed his face. "Reckon that's why I'm here, isn't it? As afternoon approached, other townspeople began to stop by, drawn by the sounds of construction. Sarah noticed how Jackson withdrew slightly with each new arrival, his responses becoming shorter, his focus more intense on his work. "Quite a project Rhodes has taken on," Reverend Clark commented quietly to Sarah, though some might wonder at his motivations. "His motivation is learning," Sarah replied firmly, straightening to her full height, "and mine is teaching. Nothing more need be wondered about." But later, watching Jackson measure and remeasure the foundation lines as the sun began to set, Sarah found herself wondering. Not about his motivations, those seemed plain enough in his honest labor, but about the circumstances that had led him to value solitude so highly. About the story behind that slight limp and the scar along his jaw. About what sort of man would undertake such a project for the sake of poetry lessons. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, as he loaded his tools back into the wagon. Sarah nodded, surprised, to find herself looking forward to it. "Don't forget to bring your copy of Wordsworth. We'll start with something that speaks of nature and honest work." "Yes, ma'am." He touched his hat brim. "Though I reckon you've already taught me something. Today, about building foundations." The walls rose steadily over the next few weeks, each beam and board a testament to Jackson's careful craftsmanship. Sarah found herself marking time not by her father's stopped watch, but by the progress of construction. The day the floor joists were laid. The morning the first wall frame stood against the sky. The afternoon they placed the final supporting beam. "You're holding that level crooked," Jackson said one morning, his voice carrying the hint of amusement she'd learned to recognize. Sarah adjusted her grip on the mason's level, determined to contribute more than just literary instruction to their arrangement. "Mathematics was never my strongest subject," she admitted, watching the bubble slide stubbornly to one side. "Give me Shakespeare over geometry any day. Shakespeare never built a house that'd stand through winter storms." He moved behind her, his calloused hands adjusting her grip on the tool. "Like this, let gravity do the work." The bubble settled perfectly center, and Sarah felt a small thrill of accomplishment. "There's poetry in this too, isn't there? In making things true and straight?" "Might be." His voice was closer than she expected, and she caught the scent of sawdust and leather that had become familiar these past weeks. "Though I reckon that's more your department than mine." Their lessons had evolved with the construction. Sarah would read aloud while Jackson worked, pausing to discuss passages that caught their attention. He had a surprising grasp of metaphor, seeing layers of meaning that sometimes surprised even her. "Frost's mending wall," he'd said yesterday, setting another board in place. "Makes more sense when you're actually building something." "How so?" she'd asked, marking her place in the book. "Good fences make good neighbors," he quoted, his usually gruff voice softening around the words. "But he questions it too, asks what he's walling in or walling out. Been thinking about that." Now, watching him check another measurement with painstaking care, Sarah understood what he meant. They were building more than walls here. They were building trust, understanding, maybe even friendship. Each day brought new revelations, how his hands could be both powerful and gentle, how he hummed hymns under his breath when concentrated, how his eyes crinkled at the corners when truly amused. "Tell me about the ranch," she said during their midday break, sharing fresh bread and cold chicken Mrs. Miller had brought by. "What made you choose Prairie Creek?" Jackson was quiet for a moment, whittling a small piece of wood with his pocket. "Knife. Wanted somewhere quiet," he finally said. "Somewhere with good soil and honest people. Somewhere to—" He paused, searching for words. "To build something new?" she offered, understanding more than she could say. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers briefly before returning to his whittling. "Your turn. Why'd you stay? After the fire?" Sarah touched her father's watch in her pocket, a habit that had become more comfort than compulsion lately. "This is home," she said simply. "Even without walls, even without books, the children still need teaching and I still need to teach." "Reckon we all need something to hold on to," he replied, holding up the piece of wood he'd been carving. A small, perfectly formed star. something to build toward. The afternoon sun caught the sawdust in the air, turning it to floating gold around them. Sarah watched Jackson return to his work, the muscles in his shoulders moving smoothly under his shirt as he lifted another beam into place. There was something hypnotic about his sureness of movement, his quiet competence. "The walls are good. And straight," he said later, as shadows lengthened across the new floorboards. "Ready for windows tomorrow." "Windows are important," Sarah mused, running her hand along the rough wood. "They let in light, show us the world outside, and let the world see in," he added softly, something vulnerable flickering across his features. Before disappearing behind his usual reserve, Sarah thought about walls then, the ones they built to protect themselves, the ones they built to keep others out, and the ones that sometimes needed windows cut through them, letting in light and air and possibility. "Same time tomorrow?" she asked, their usual evening farewell taking on new meaning. Jackson nodded, gathering his tools with familiar care. "Brought something for next lesson," he said, reaching into his saddlebag. "Found it in town." He handed her a small volume of Emily Dickinson poems, only slightly weathered. "Hope is the thing with feathers," Sarah whispered, remembering the copy she'd given Mary Catherine, now lost to the flames. "Thought maybe," he hesitated, "thought maybe we could start there tomorrow, if you're willing to teach me about hope." Sarah clutched the book to her chest, watching him ride away in the fading light. The walls of her new home rose around her, strong and true, but it was the windows they'd build tomorrow that filled her thoughts as darkness fell. Sarah found the newspaper clipping on a Tuesday morning when a gust of wind scattered papers from Jackson's saddlebag across the half-finished porch. She caught most of them, construction notes and supply lists, but the yellowed piece of newsprint nearly escaped her grasp. The date caught her eye first, April 15th, 1945. Then the headline, "Local Hero Returns. Distinguished Service Cross Recipient Comes Home." The photograph showed a younger Jackson Rhodes in military dress, standing straight-backed beside a woman, in a simple wedding dress. His face was smoother then, unmarked by the scar that now traced his jaw, but his eyes held the same quiet intensity. The caption read, "Captain Jackson Rhodes and new bride Eleanor celebrate homecoming." "Didn't mean for you to see that," she startled at his voice behind her. Jackson stood in the doorway, his frame silhouetted against the morning light, hands gripping a length of timber so tightly his knuckles showed white. "I'm sorry," she said, moving to return the clipping. "The wind, keep reading." His voice was rough but not angry. "Might as well know the whole tale." Sarah's eyes returned to the article, scanning quickly. "Distinguished Service Cross for Valor Under Fire in the Pacific. Serious injuries, months of recovery." Then near the bottom, a smaller headline from 3 months later, "Tragedy Strikes. Fire Claims Wife of War Hero." "Eleanor always loved candles," Jackson said quietly, setting down the timber and moving to stand beside her. "Kept them burning while I was away," she wrote, "like a beacon calling me home." He paused, his breathing uneven. "Doctor said the laudanum made her careless. She'd been taking it for the pain after losing the baby." Sarah's hand found his arm, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Jackson, I'm so sorry. Fire took everything. Just like yours did." His voice was distant, lost in memory. "Thought I was done with building after that, done with hoping. Bought the ranch here because nobody knew me. Nobody asked questions. Understanding dawned like sunrise. Until you heard about another fire," she said softly. "About someone else who lost everything." He nodded, still not meeting her eyes. "Saw you that first morning, straightening books that weren't there anymore. Recognized that look, the one that says you're holding yourself together by sheer will." Sarah thought about pride then, how it could be both armor and prison, how it had kept her sleeping in ruins rather than accepting help. How it might have kept Jackson isolated on his ranch, building fences against memory. "Is that why you offered to build?" she asked. "Because you understood the loss?" "Partly." He finally turned to face her, his eyes holding hers steadily. "But mostly because you didn't let it break you. Saw you teaching phantom classes in the ashes, keeping your dignity when others would have crumbled. Made me think maybe—" He trailed off, searching for words. Maybe what? Maybe it was time to build. Something again, something more than fences. The morning breeze carried the scent of fresh-cut lumber and prairie grass, stirring Sarah's skirts and lifting strands of hair from her careful bun. She was acutely aware of Jackson's presence beside her, of the quiet strength and hidden wounds he carried. "You know," she said carefully, "I've been teaching Wordsworth all wrong." His eyebrow lifted slightly at the apparent non sequitur. "How's that?" "The best portion of a good man's life. His little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and love," she quoted softly. "I always taught it as simple appreciation for small gestures, but standing here now, I think it's about courage too. The courage to keep offering kindness, even after loss. To keep building even when you know how easily things can burn." Jackson's hand found hers, rough calluses against ink-stained fingers. "Reckon you might be teaching me more than just reading, Miss Bennett." "Sarah," she corrected gently. "I think after sharing this, you might call me Sarah." He nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Sarah." Her name in his voice sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "We should get back to work. Still got those windows to frame." But he didn't move immediately, and neither did she. They stood together in the morning light, the old newspaper clipping trembling between them like a shared secret, while around them the house they were building rose steady and strong against the prairie sky. The storm came without warning, sweeping across the prairie like God's own broom. One minute Sarah was reading from Jane Eyre, watching Jackson work on the roof trusses, and the next, the world turned slate gray and threatening. "Your knee was right," she called up to him, marking their place in the book as the first fat drops began to fall. Though its timing could have been more precise, Jackson was already climbing down, his movements quick but careful. "Storm's moving. Faster than I expected. We need to—" Thunder cracked overhead, drowning out his words as the sky opened up in earnest. They rushed to secure tools and materials, working in practiced tandem after weeks of shared labor. Sarah gathered the books and papers, while Jackson covered the lumber with tarpaulins, rain plastering his shirt to his shoulders. "Inside!" he shouted over the wind, gesturing to the partially finished house. The roof wasn't complete, but enough framework was in place to offer some shelter. Sarah hesitated only a moment before ducking through the doorframe, Jackson close behind. Rain drummed against the wooden skeleton of the house, creating an odd symphony as water found its way through the unfinished roof in sporadic streams. They stood in what would become the front room, watching nature test the strength of their building. "Here," Jackson said, shrugging out of his coat and draping it over her shoulders. "You're shivering." She was, though not entirely from the cold. Water dripped from her loosened hair, and her dress clung to her in a way that would have scandalized the Ladies' Aid Society. Jackson wasn't much better, his white shirt transparent, his dark hair curling damply at his neck. The blueprints. Getting wet, she noticed, reaching for where he'd left it that morning on a makeshift table. Their hands met over the rain-speckled paper, and neither pulled away immediately. "Ink's running," he observed, his voice low and close. In the storm-dark space, every sound felt intimate. The patter of rain, their breathing, the occasional rumble of thunder. Sarah traced a finger along the blurring lines of the drawing. "Like watercolors now. See how the library bleeds into the kitchen? Rather poetic, really." "Poetry in everything with you." His tone held warmth she'd grown to treasure, even in ruined drawings. "Not ruined," she corrected, still studying the way the ink spread and merged. "Changed, like everything else the rain touches." She glanced up then, finding his eyes on her with an expression that made her breath catch. A particularly strong gust rattled the framework, sending a cascade of droplets through the exposed beams. Sarah stepped back instinctively, colliding gently with Jackson's chest. His hands steadied her shoulders, and for a moment neither moved. "I used to love storms," he said quietly, not releasing her. Before, used to sit on the porch with Eleanor and watch them roll in across the plains. Sarah turned to face him, still within the circle of his arms. And now, he seemed to be choosing his words carefully. Now, I'm learning to see beauty in them again, in how they change things, clean things. His thumb brushed a raindrop from her cheek. Show us truth. The truth between them in that moment was as clear as lightning across the prairie sky. All these weeks of building together, walls, trust, something more, had led them here, to this unfinished room with rain making music on the beams above. "Jackson," she whispered, her teacher's vocabulary failing her. "I know," he replied, simply. His hand was warm against her cheek, and she leaned into it slightly, allowing herself this moment of vulnerability. They didn't kiss. They weren't ready for that step, not yet. But something shifted between them, as surely as the storm was shifting the world outside. They stood together in their half-built house, watching rain draw patterns on the floor, each lost in thoughts of endings and beginnings. Rain's letting. "Up," Jackson noted eventually, though he made no move to step away. Sarah nodded, reluctantly straightening. "We should check for damage. Framework's solid," he said with quiet confidence. "Built to weather storms." She caught his meaning and smiled, shrugging off his coat to return it. "Like good foundations, like good partnerships." He took the coat, but caught her hand in the process, holding it for a moment longer than necessary. "Sarah." "I know." She echoed his earlier response, understanding all he wasn't saying. They had time. They were building something too precious to rush. The storm moved on, leaving behind puddles that reflected the clearing sky and air that smelled of wet wood and possibility. They emerged from their shelter changed, like the rain-smeared blueprint, lines blurring and reforming into something new and unexpected and true. Sarah stood at the newly installed chalkboard, enjoying the familiar feel of chalk between her fingers. Jackson had mounted it that morning, a surprise that had brought unexpected tears to her eyes. Now, in the late afternoon light, she wrote, in her best teaching hand, "Today's lesson, Great Expectations, Chapter 1. "Feels proper now," Jackson said from where he sat at the makeshift desk he'd constructed, his large frame making it look almost comically small. "Having a real chalkboard instead of writing in dirt with a stick," Sarah smiled, remembering their early lessons scratched in earth and ash. "Are you suggesting my innovative teaching methods were lacking, Mr. Rhodes?" "Wouldn't dare, Miss Bennett." His eyes held that warm amusement she'd grown to cherish. "Though I admit, sitting inside out of the sun has its advantages." The house was taking shape around them, walls enclosed, roof nearly complete. They'd fallen into a new rhythm, mornings for construction, afternoons for lessons. Today, with rain threatening again, they'd moved inside early. "Now then," Sarah said, settling into her teaching voice, "tell me what you remember from yesterday's introduction to Charles Dickens." Jackson shifted in his seat, and she recognized the look of a student gathering courage. Born 1812 in Portsmouth, wrote about London mostly, poor folks and rich folks, and how life ain't fair to either, really. "Isn't," she corrected gently. "Life isn't fair." "Isn't," he repeated, the word careful in his mouth. Then, with a slight smile, "though ain't has its place in honest speech, I reckon." "Perhaps in conversation," she allowed, "but we're focusing on formal English today. Now, about young Pip in the churchyard." She lost herself in the familiar rhythm of teaching, but this was different from her schoolroom days. Jackson brought a lifetime of experience to his reading, finding layers of meaning she'd never considered. When they discussed Pip's encounter with the convict, his insights were unexpectedly profound. "Man can be both terrible and human at once," he observed quietly. "Seen that during the war. Sometimes mercy and cruelty walk hand in hand." Sarah paused in her notes on the chalkboard, struck by the depth of understanding in his words. That's exactly what Dickens is exploring, the complexity of human nature. Learned that from life before I learned it from books." He stood, moving to examine her neat chalk notes. But books help us make sense of living, don't they? Put words to things we know but can't explain. Yes, she breathed, suddenly aware of how close he stood. That's precisely why literature matters. He reached past her to correct a smudge on the chalkboard, his sleeve brushing her shoulder. Like poetry? Putting words to things that are hard to say? Sarah's heart quickened at his tone. Since the day of the storm, something had shifted between them, nothing spoken, but a new awareness humming like electricity in the air. Speaking of poetry, she managed, turning to face him, your assignment for tomorrow is Tennyson's Ulysses. I think you'll find it especially relevant. How so? Though much is taken, much abides, she quoted softly. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, he finished unexpectedly. At her surprised look, he ducked, his head slightly. Might have been reading ahead a bit. Jackson Rhodes, she said with mock severity, are you becoming a scholar behind my back? Got a good teacher, he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her grip her chalk tighter. Makes me want to learn everything she has to teach. The afternoon light slanted through the new windows, casting long shadows across the floorboards. Outside, a meadowlark called to its mate, and somewhere in town the church bells chimed the hour. Sarah was acutely conscious of the space between them, of how easily it could be crossed. We should review your penmanship, she said finally, settling back into safer territory. Your R's still need work. He returned to his desk, but his eyes held a promise that had nothing to do with handwriting. Yes, ma'am, though I've been practicing. Here, he pulled out a sheet of carefully written lines. Hope is the thing with feathers. Each letter was formed with painstaking precision, each line straight and true as the walls around them. Beautiful, she said, touching the paper gently. You've made real progress. Got something worth working toward, he replied quietly. Makes all the difference. Sarah turned back to the chalkboard, adding another note about Dickens's themes, aware of Jackson's steady presence behind her. They were building something here, in these afternoon lessons. Something as solid and real as the house rising around them, but infinitely more precious. The first maple leaves were turning gold when Jackson suggested they take their lesson outside. Too fine a day to stay indoors, he said, gathering their books. Sarah noticed he handled her volumes with the same gentle care he gave to his woodworking. Tools, each movement deliberate and respectful. They settled on the newly finished front porch, the boards still smelling of fresh varnish. Sarah had brought her pressed flower album, salvaged from Mary Catherine's house, where she'd left it for safekeeping before the fire. Its pages held 30 years of Prairie Creek seasons, violets from her first spring teaching, black-eyed, Susans from countless summer walks, russet oak leaves from long-ago autumns. Never understood the point of pressing flowers, Jackson admitted, watching her turn the delicate pages. Always seemed like preserving something that's meant to fade. Perhaps that's exactly why we do it, Sarah replied. To remind ourselves that beautiful things, even fleeting ones, leave lasting impressions. She smiled, touching a dried prairie rose. Besides, there's science in it too. Botany was part of our curriculum. Teaching even now, he observed, with that quiet smile that made her heart flutter. Can't help yourself, can you? Says the man who spent an hour yesterday explaining to young Tommy Anderson the precise angle needed for proper roof drainage. Jackson's laugh, still rare enough to be precious, rolled across the porch. Boy's got a mind for engineering. Reminds me of myself at that age, always wanting to know how things work. A wagon rattled past on the street, Mrs. Miller at the reins. She waved, calling out, "Afternoon, Miss Bennett, Mr. Rhodes." Her smile held knowing warmth, and Sarah realized with a start how they must look, sitting close on the porch like any other courting couple. The thought should have alarmed her, should have sent her retreating behind propriety's walls. Instead, she felt a quiet thrill, like opening a new book to find exactly the story you needed to read. Whole towns talking, Jackson said softly after Mrs. Miller passed. About us, about this. He gestured vaguely between them. Does that bother? You. He considered the question with his usual care. Spent a long time avoiding talk, avoiding people. Now he plucked a golden leaf from the porch rail, turning it in his calloused fingers. Now I find I don't mind so much. Not if it's talk about you and me. Sarah watched his hands, thinking about how they could be both powerful enough to raise house beams and gentle enough to hold a leaf without crushing it. I've been thinking about Blake, she said, returning to safer ground. About joy and experience. He who binds himself to a joy does the winged life destroy, Jackson quoted, surprising her again with his growing knowledge. But he also wrote about building, didn't he? In seed time learn, in harvest teach, in winter enjoy. Very good, she said, teacher's pride mixing with something deeper. Though I believe we're approaching our own harvest season, he nodded, looking at the nearly completed house. Week or two more, I reckon, just finishing touches now. Neither mentioned what would happen after, when there was no more construction to oversee, no reason for daily lessons. The thought hung between them like autumn mist, heavy with possibility and uncertainty. A breeze stirred the maple leaves above them, sending a shower of gold spiraling down. Without thinking, Sarah caught one, automatically opening her flower album to press it. Wait, Jackson said, his hand covering hers. Maybe some moments don't need preserving. Maybe they're better lived. She met his eyes then, seeing in them the same mixture of hope and caution she felt in her own heart. The leaf trembled between their joined hands, as delicate as the moment itself. Sarah, he began, then stopped as voices approached, several of her former students walking home from the new schoolhouse. Miss Bennett, they called out, clustering around the porch. Are you coming back to teach when your house is done? The new teacher doesn't explain things half so well. Sarah felt Jackson's hand squeeze hers briefly before releasing it. That's not my decision to make, she told the children. But her eyes were on Jackson, though I must admit I've grown rather fond of teaching again. Reckon Prairie Creek could use 2 schools, he said casually, but his eyes held meaning. Town's growing, might need a proper academy soon, with a proper library. The children chattered excitedly at this prospect, but Sarah barely heard them. She was too busy watching golden leaves dance in the autumn light, thinking about seasons changing, about endings that were really beginnings, and about the quiet joy of building something lasting, one careful piece at a time. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by the afternoon stage, along with a rush of cold October wind. Sarah was adding the final touches to the bookshelves. Jackson had built them exactly as promised, with spaces sized perfectly for her teaching materials, when she heard the commotion outside. Jackie, good Lord, it really is you. The voice was feminine, cultured, and entirely foreign to Prairie Creek. Sarah moved to the window, drawn by its unexpected presence. A woman stood in the street, all city refinement and careful grace. Her traveling suit speaking of railroad money and St. Louis fashion houses, but it was Jackson who caught and held Sarah's attention. He stood frozen by his wagon, a length of crown molding forgotten in his hands, staring at the woman as if seeing a ghost. Margaret, he said finally, his voice rough. What are you? Your mother wrote me. The woman, Margaret, stepped closer, her heeled boots clicking against the wooden sidewalk. When she heard about all this, she gestured at the house, at Sarah visible in the window. I had to see for myself. Sarah's hands found the faded marriage certificate she'd discovered, tucked in Jackson's old volume of Wordsworth just yesterday. She'd meant to ask him about it. Margaret Elizabeth Whitman, the name had read, with a date 5 years after Eleanor's death. No mention of dissolution. But then, some things didn't need official papers to end them. You should have written. First, Jackson said, setting down the molding with exaggerated care. Sarah recognized the gesture. He did the same thing when struggling to contain emotion, like you wrote to me. Margaret's laugh held no humor. 3 years of marriage, Jackie, and all I got was a note. Can't do this anymore. Don't try to. You find me. That's not how a husband treats his wife. The word hung in the autumn air like frost, Sarah stepped back from the window, her mind spinning. She knew about Eleanor. Jackson had shared that grief. But this was different. This was a living, breathing claim on the man who had become the center of her carefully rebuilt world. Not here, Margaret. Jackson's voice was tight. Not in the street. Where then? In the house you're building for another woman? Oh yes, Mother. Rhodes told me all about the school teacher who lost everything, about how you're finding yourself again. Did you tell her about us, Jackie? About how you abandoned? That's enough. The sharpness in Jackson's tone was something Sarah had never heard before. You made your choice when you tried to sell the ranch. My father's ranch. You knew what it meant to me. It was just land. We could have had a life in the city, culture, society. It was home. Jackson's words carried clearly through the window. Something you never understood. Sarah moved away, not wanting to hear more. Her feet carried her to the newly installed chalkboard where just that morning she and Jackson had discussed Milton's Paradise Lost. The mind is its own place, she had written in her careful script, and in itself can make a heaven of hell, a hell of heaven. The sound of the front door opening brought her back to the present. Jackson stood in the doorway, his face shadowed. Sarah, you don't owe me any explanations, she said quickly, though her heart argued otherwise. Yes, I do. He moved into the room but kept his distance, as if afraid to come too close. Margaret and I, it was a mistake. Both of us trying to forget other people. She wanted to forget her fiancé who died in the war. I wanted to forget Eleanor. We thought maybe two broken people could make something whole. Sarah touched the chalkboard, letting the familiar feel of chalk dust ground her. What happened? We destroyed each other instead. His voice held old pain. She wanted to change everything I was, everything I believed in, wanted to turn me into some city gentleman who'd forgotten the smell of honest work and prairie grass. When she tried to sell the ranch while I was away, he shook his head. I couldn't stay, couldn't watch her erase every memory of my father, of Eleanor, of who I really was. So you ran. The words came out more sharply than she intended. So I ran, he agreed quietly. Not my proudest moment. But Sarah, he took a step closer. Everything I ran from then? It's the opposite of what we're building here. You don't try to change me. He gestured at the chalkboard, the bookshelves, the house rising around them. You help me become more myself. Through the window, Sarah could see Margaret still standing in the street, her elegant figure out of place against the prairie backdrop. She's still your wife, she said softly. No, Jackson's voice was firm. She has a paper that says she was once, but she was never my partner. Not like... He stopped, but his eyes held hers, saying everything his words didn't. Outside, the October wind picked up, rattling the new windows like the past demanding attention. Sarah thought about pressed flowers and faded marriage certificates, about the difference between preserving something dead and nurturing something living. What happens now? She asked. Jackson's hands, those beautiful, capable hands that had built her new home, clenched at his sides. That depends, he said quietly, on whether you can trust a man who once ran away. Frost etched delicate patterns on the windows, nature's artwork transforming glass into crystal galleries. Sarah stood at the kitchen window, watching her breath cloud the intricate designs as Margaret's carriage disappeared into the gathering. At dusk, 3 days of polite warfare had ended with papers signed and a past officially laid to rest. She's gone, Jackson said from the doorway, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Divorce will be final by spring. Sarah nodded, not turning. Around. The window's cold surface grounded her, helped her think clearly. You could have told me, she said finally, about the marriage, about running. Wasn't proud of it. His boots scraped against the floorboards as he moved closer. Kept telling myself I'd find the right moment. Then days became weeks, and the longer you waited, the harder it became. She understood that all too well, remembering her own pride, keeping her sleeping in ruins, rather than admitting she needed help. Sarah, his voice was closer now. Look at me, please. She turned, finding him barely an arm's length away. The past. Days had left their mark. New lines around his eyes, a tension in his shoulders she hadn't seen since those first weeks after the fire. "I've been thinking about Jane Eyre," she said, surprising them both, "about secrets and trust and the price of hiding truth." A small smile touched his lips. "Teaching even now?" "Always." She met his eyes steadily. "Do you remember what Jane told Rochester? I'm not talking to you now through the medium of custom, conventionalities, nor even of mortal flesh. It is my spirit that addresses your spirit. Asking for truth," he said quietly. "Plain and unvarnished." "Yes." Sarah moved to the chalkboard, her fingers finding the familiar comfort of chalk. "So let's have truth, Jackson. All of it." He watched her write truth in her precise script. Then below it, fear. "That's the heart of it, isn't it? What we're really afraid of." "Tell me," she said simply. Jackson ran a hand through his hair, silver threading through dark in the winter light. "Afraid of failing again, of not being enough, of—" he paused, choosing his words carefully, "of building something beautiful only to watch it burn. With Eleanor it was fate. With Margaret it was my own doing. And now, with you, with me, with you, it matters more than either." His voice roughened. "Because you understand building. Understanding losing everything and starting again. Understanding that some things are worth the risk of burning." Sarah added another word to the board. "Trust." "Your turn," he said softly. "What are you afraid of?" She gripped the chalk tighter, forcing herself to face the truth she'd been avoiding. "Afraid of depending on someone again, of letting myself need." She swallowed hard. "The fire taught me how quickly everything can disappear. Everyone said I was brave, sleeping in the ruins, but it wasn't bravery. It was fear. If I didn't let myself accept help, didn't let myself need anything or anyone. You couldn't lose it again," he finished, understanding in his voice. "But I failed at that too." She turned to face him, tears threatening. "Because somewhere between the first foundation stone and today, I started needing you. Not just your help, not just the house you're building, but you, Jackson Rhodes. Your quiet strength, your hidden gentleness, the way you see beauty in broken things." The chalk slipped from her fingers, leaving a dusty trail on the floor. Jackson stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "Sarah Bennett," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I've been needing you since the first morning I saw you teaching phantom children in the ashes. Needed your courage, your dignity, your way of finding hope in hard places. Everything I've built here, this house, these walls, these new dreams, they're stronger because you helped build them." Outside, snow began to fall, soft and steady. As mercy. Sarah watched it through the window, thinking about fresh starts and clean slates. "I can't promise never to run again," Jackson said quietly. "But I can promise to run toward you, not away, to build something stronger than fear." Sarah thought about the house around them, how every beam and board had been placed with care and purpose, about how the strongest structures were the ones that could bend without breaking. "The heart has reasons that reason cannot know," she quoted softly. "Pascal wrote that. What does your heart say?" His hand found hers, chalk dust mixing with calluses. She looked at their joined hands, at the snow falling beyond the frosted windows, at the words still written on the board. "Truth. Fear, trust. It says," she whispered, "that some things are worth risking everything for." Jackson's arms went around her then, and she leaned into his strength, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. Outside, winter wrapped the world in white, while inside, truth and trust bloomed like flowers pressed between pages, preserved not in death but in transformation. The last nail waited on the workbench, its brass head catching the February sunlight. Sarah watched Jackson turn it between his fingers, both of them aware of its significance. This final piece would secure the decorative medallion above the front door, the last element of their months-long labor. "Seems almost wrong to finish it," Jackson said, his voice quiet in the crisp morning air. "Like closing the last page of a beloved book." Sarah smiled, recognizing her own influence in his metaphor. "But that's not really the end, is it? The best books stay with us long after we close them. We carry their stories forward. He looked at her then, his eyes holding that mixture of tenderness and uncertainty she'd come to know so well. Since their conversation in the snow-wrapped house 2 months ago, something had been building between them, as carefully constructed as the home they'd created. "Been thinking," he said, setting the nail down deliberately, "about stories, about endings and beginnings." "Have you?" She kept her tone light, though her heart quickened. "Remember that first day, when I brought the plans?" He retrieved the original drawings from his workbench, their edges worn soft with handling. Had everything measured out, every board and beam accounted for. Thought I knew exactly what I was building. Sarah touched the papers gently, tracing the careful lines. "And now? Now I realize I was drawing the wrong thing entirely." He unfolded a new paper, one she hadn't seen before. "Been working on this instead." The drawing showed not just her house, but the entire property. There was a proper schoolhouse sketched behind it, with a connecting covered walkway, a garden space, a stable, everything needed for a life built for two. "Jackson," she breathed, understanding dawning. "Told you once I was done with building after Eleanor died, then told myself I was done with marriage after Margaret left." His calloused fingers traced the lines of the schoolhouse, but that wasn't true. Just needed to find the right foundation to build on, the right partner to build with. He reached into his pocket and withdrew something small and bright. A ring, but not the kind she'd expected. Instead of diamonds or fancy settings, it was a simple band fashioned from brass, similar to the final nail that would complete their house. "Made it myself," he said quietly, "from the same brass we used for the door fittings. Thought it fitting. Since this house brought us together, since you taught me that beautiful things can rise from ashes." Sarah's vision blurred with tears as she took in the ring's careful craftsmanship, the way it caught the light like promise. "I'm not offering just marriage," he continued. "I'm offering partnership, a chance to build something larger than ourselves. This town needs more than one schoolhouse, needs teachers who understand both books and life." He gestured to his plans. "We could do it together, build a proper academy, give other lost souls a place to find themselves." Sarah thought about that. First morning after the fire, how she'd stood in the ashes of her old life, too proud to accept help. Thought about how far they'd both come, learning to trust, to need, to build together. "I have conditions," she said, her teacher's voice steady despite her trembling hands. A smile touched his lips. "Expected nothing less. First, we maintain separate classrooms. I won't have you distracting my students with your impromptu engineering. Lessons, fair enough. Second, we keep the chalkboard where it is, for poetry readings and mathematics and," she faltered slightly, "and for our children, should we be blessed with them." His breath caught at that, hope and fear mingling in his eyes. "And third," she picked up the final nail, its weight familiar, in her hand. "Third, we place this together, this last piece, equal partners from this moment forward." Jackson's hand covered hers, warm and strong around the nail. "Equal partners," he agreed softly, "in everything." They moved together to the front door, where the medallion waited for its final securing. The morning sun painted everything in shades of promise as they positioned the nail together. "Ready?" he whispered. Sarah looked at their joined hands, at the brass ring catching the light at the house they'd built from ashes and hope. "For where thou art, there is the world itself," she quoted softly, "and where thou art not, desolation." Shakespeare. His voice was rough with emotion. Henry VI. "Though I think we can write our own poetry from here." Together they drove, the final nail home, its solid sound ringing out across the prairie like a bell calling children to lessons, like a hammer shaping raw material into something fine, like a heart finding its way home at last. Spring came to Prairie Creek in a rush of green, as if nature herself was hurrying to witness the transformation. The house gleamed in the April sunshine, its windows bright with promise, while all around it, Sarah's newly planted garden showed, The first brave shoots pushing through dark earth. The whole town had turned out for the house blessing and celebration, their wagons and buggies forming a circle around the property like a protective embrace. Reverend Clark stood on the front porch, his Bible open to Ecclesiastes, while Sarah and Jackson faced their neighbors from the steps they'd built together. "Two are better than one," the Reverend read, "because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up." Sarah felt Jackson's hand tighten around hers, both of them thinking of falls and rising, of ashes and rebuilding. She wore her best dress, a gift from the Ladies' Aid Society, but her real finery was the brass ring catching sunlight on her finger, matching the medallion above their door. "Ain't never seen a house blessing quite like this," Mrs. Miller whispered loudly to her neighbor. "But then, ain't never seen a courtship quite like theirs neither, building a house together before they even stepped out proper." A ripple of knowing laughter moved through the crowd. Sarah felt herself blush, but Jackson's quiet chuckle beside her held no embarrassment. "Built it right the first time," he said, his voice carrying both the house and the relationship. Mary Catherine stepped forward then, clutching a familiar volume. Mrs. Rhodes, I brought your poetry book back, the one you gave me before the fire. Thought maybe it should come home now." Sarah accepted the worn copy of Emily Dickinson, its pages softened with use. "Have you shared it with others, as I asked?" The girl nodded eagerly. "Been reading it to Mama while she sews, and to my little sister. She loves the one about hope, having feathers." "Then keep it," Sarah said, pressing the book back into Mary Catherine's hands. "A good book should always be moving forward, touching new lives." She glanced at Jackson. "Sometimes we have to let go of old things to make room for new ones." After the blessing came the celebration proper, with tables groaning under the weight of covered dishes and pies. Children played tag around the new flower beds, while their parents admired the house's craftsmanship, and Sarah's traditional teaching certificate rehung in its place of honor. "Going to be quite a thing," Sheriff Wade said, examining Jackson's plans for the academy. 2 schools in Prairie Creek, towns growing up proper. 3 schools, Sarah corrected, sharing a smile with Jackson. The regular school, the academy for older students, and evening classes for adults who want to further their education. Her eyes found Mrs. Henderson, who still carried the guilt of the fire. It's never too late to learn something new. As the afternoon lengthened, Sarah found herself on the porch steps, watching Jackson demonstrate proper roof angles to an enthusiastic group of young boys. He caught her eye across the yard and touched his hat brim in their private signal, making her heart flutter like a schoolgirl's. "You've done a fine thing here," Reverend Clark said, settling beside her. "Both of you built something larger than yourselves." "We're not finished building," she replied, thinking of the academy plans, of the future stretching out before them like an unwritten page. "Just getting started, really." The Reverend nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Life's funny that way. Sometimes we have to lose everything to find what we really need." The spring breeze carried the scent of new grass and possibility, stirring the curtains Sarah had hung just that morning. Through the open windows came the sounds of community, children's laughter, women's gossip, men's deep discussions of weather and crops, all of it weaving together into the fabric of belonging. "Time for the house tour," Jackson called, mounting the steps. He offered Sarah his arm with exaggerated gallantry, making her laugh. Together, they led their neighbors through the rooms they'd crafted so carefully. The library, with its floor-to-ceiling shelves. The study with 2 desks facing each other. The kitchen designed for teaching as well as cooking. Every space held meaning. Every detail told their story. "And this," Sarah said finally, opening the door to a small room off the library, "will be our classroom. For special cases, advanced students, or anyone needing extra attention, on the wall hung the chalkboard where they'd shared their first real lessons. Below it, carefully preserved in a frame, lay the original architectural drawings, their edges soft with handling, and beside them, pressed between glass, was a single golden maple leaf, the one they'd caught together that autumn day on the porch. "Not everything needs preserving," Jackson said softly, echoing his words from that day, "but some moments deserve remembering." Sarah looked at their gathered neighbors, at the house they'd built together, at the man who had helped her rise from ashes to build something far greater than she'd lost. "Some moments," she agreed, "are just the beginning." The first thank you letter arrived on a warm May morning, just as Sarah was setting up for the day's lessons. The envelope, addressed in careful cursive to Mr. and Mrs. Rhodes, contained a single sheet of lined paper and a pressed wildflower. "Dear Miss Bennett, I know you're Mrs. Rhodes now, but you'll always be Miss Bennett to me," Sarah read aloud as Jackson looked up from his drafting table in the corner. "Thanks to your evening classes, I can finally write my own letters home. Ma cried when she got the first one, said she never thought she'd see the day her daughter could write proper. The flower is from her garden. She said to tell you that knowledge, like flowers, keeps growing once you plant it." The letter was signed Ruby Henderson, and Sarah's throat tightened at the sight of the careful signature. Ruby was Mrs. Henderson's oldest, 22, and married with 2 little ones of her own. She'd been so ashamed of not knowing her letters that she'd only agreed to come to classes if Sarah promised not to tell anyone else in town. "She's got a good hand," Jackson observed, moving to study the letter over Sarah's shoulder. "Strong and sure, like she's not afraid of the paper anymore." "Like someone else I know," Sarah smiled, touching the lesson plans he'd written out that morning, his penmanship now as precise as his architectural drawings. "Though I seem to recall a certain student who once declared written words his mortal enemy had a good teacher." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Still do, every day." The academy was taking shape behind their home, its foundation already laid, and walls rising steady as dreams. They'd designed it together, blending Jackson's practical knowledge with Sarah's understanding of what a schoolroom needed. Large windows for natural light, built-in bookcases, and a special feature that had been Jackson's surprise, a covered walkway connecting it to their house so Sarah wouldn't have to wade through snow in winters to come. Their daily rhythm had evolved into something as natural as breathing. Mornings were for regular lessons, Sarah with her younger students in the main schoolhouse in town, Jackson overseeing the academy's construction. Afternoons brought the older students, eager to learn advanced mathematics and literature in preparation for college or careers. Evenings were for adult education, with both of them teaching according to their strengths. "Got another letter here," Jackson said, retrieving an envelope from his pocket. "From Thomas Cooper, that rancher's boy from out past Miller's Creek, the one who wanted to learn engineering." Sarah set Ruby's letter carefully aside and accepted the new one. "The one you've been teaching advanced mathematics?" "Same." Jackson's voice held quiet pride. University of Colorado accepted him for their engineering program. Full scholarship. Together. They read Thomas's excited words, his thanks spilling across the page in boyish enthusiasm. "Never thought I'd get to be more than a ranch hand," he wrote. "But Mr. Rhodes showed me how mathematics built the world, and Mrs. Rhodes taught me how to put my dreams into words proper enough for university folk to understand. We're changing lives," Sarah said softly, touching the letters. "Not just teaching facts and figures, but opening doors, building futures," Jackson agreed. "Though sometimes I wonder if we're learning more than we're teaching." Before Sarah could respond, a knock at the door announced their first students of the afternoon. Mary Catherine led a group of older girls, their arms full of books, and their faces eager. "Mrs. Rhodes," Mary Catherine called, "is it true what they say about Jane Austen, that she never married but still wrote the best love stories ever?" "Come in," Sarah laughed, "and let's discuss the many forms of happiness one might find in life." She shared a meaningful glance with Jackson as he gathered his tools to return to the academy construction, and how sometimes the best stories are the ones we never expected to live. The afternoon unfolded like a well-loved book, each hour bringing its own revelations. Sarah taught her girls about literature and life, hearing echoes of her own journey in their questions about love and purpose and building meaningful lives. Through the windows, she could hear Jackson's deep voice, explaining geometric principles to a group of boys as they helped with the academy's construction, learning through doing. Later, as sunset painted the prairie gold, they sat on their porch, reviewing the day's letters. More had arrived throughout the afternoon, each one a testament to lives touched and changes wrought. "Thank you for showing me that it's never too late," Jackson read from one. "That a man can be more than what life first made him." Sarah leaned against his shoulder, watching the last light gild their growing garden. "We're building more than just a school, aren't we?" "Always were," he replied softly. "From that first foundation stone, we were building hope, building futures, building proof that something beautiful can rise from ashes if you've got the courage to try again." A meadowlark called from the prairie grass, its evening song carrying across the deepening dusk. Inside their home, the lamp they'd lit together cast warm light through windows that had seen them through seasons of change, and everywhere around them, in every nail and board and lesson plan, stood testament to the truth they'd learned together, that the strongest structures were built, not just with hands but with heart. 1 year to the day after the fire, Sarah woke before dawn. She lay quietly, listening to Jackson's steady breathing beside her, watching pale light seep through the windows they'd installed together. Her father's pocket watch rested on the bedside. Table, still frozen at 3:42, now mounted in a wooden frame Jackson had carved. A reminder not of what was lost, but of what had been found. The anniversary had been approaching like a storm cloud on the horizon, causing whispers around town and concerned glances from neighbors. But Sarah felt oddly peaceful. She slipped from bed, wrapped herself in a shawl, and made her way to the front porch. The academy's bell tower rose against the lightening sky, its new bronze bell waiting for its first official ringing later that day. Jackson had insisted on having it ready for this date specifically, understanding without words the importance of replacing what the fire had taken with something stronger, something built together. "Couldn't sleep either." His voice came soft behind her as he draped a quilt over her shoulders. Even now, the gesture reminded her of that first rain-soaked day when he'd given her his coat, when walls were just lines on paper, and trust was as fragile as ash. "Just thinking," she replied, leaning back against him, "about how life moves in circles. 1 year ago I stood in ruins, too proud to accept help. Now here we stand, in a home we built together, about to open a school that will help others rebuild their lives." "Got something to show you," Jackson said, taking her hand. "Been saving it for today." He led her through their house, past the library where they still held evening lessons, past the study where they planned curricula together, through the kitchen where they'd taught Mrs. Henderson's daughters to read recipes and write their own. Every room held memories of building, of learning, of growing together. In the classroom, he stopped before the chalkboard where they'd shared their first real lessons. But instead of lesson plans, the board held something new, a detailed drawing of the entire property, showing not just what was, but what would be. "Phase 2, he explained, his voice warm with excitement. "Dormitories for students from outlying farms, a proper library big enough for the whole town, a garden where children can learn about growing things." His hand found hers. "If you're willing to keep building with me." Sarah studied the plans, recognizing in them the same care he'd put into their home's original drawings. But these showed more than just buildings. They showed a vision of community, of growth, of transformation. "Look closer," he urged, pointing to a small, detailed section. There, carefully drawn, was a memorial garden. In its center stood a bell tower, but not like the academy's proud new spire. This was the original schoolhouse bell, recovered from the ashes, mounted as a reminder of resilience and renewal. "Oh, Jackson," she whispered, touching the drawing with trembling fingers. "Thought we could dedicate it today," he said. "After The Academy's opening ceremony. Plant some of those flowers you've been pressing, new life growing around old memories. Before she could respond, the sound of wagon wheels drew their attention. Through the window, they saw Mrs. Henderson's cart approaching, followed by others. Soon their yard filled with townspeople, each carrying something: flowers, food, books for the Academy's library. "We remembered what day it was," Mary Catherine said, now tall enough to look Sarah in the eye. "Thought you shouldn't be alone." "Brought my mother's roses," Mrs. Henderson added softly, "for the memorial garden Mr. Rhodes told us about. Seems fitting, seeing as how my carelessness led to all this." She gestured at the Academy, the house, the community gathered around them. "Though I never imagined such beauty could come from my mistake." Sarah took the older woman's hands in hers. "Time you forgave yourself," she said gently. "Look what has grown from those ashes." As if in response, the rising sun broke through the morning mist, catching the new Academy bell and making it shine like hope itself. Jackson moved to her side, solid and steady as the foundations they'd laid together. "Shall we ring it?" he asked quietly. "Mark the moment properly." Sarah looked at their gathered neighbors, at the home they'd built, at the future taking shape in careful plans and shared dreams. She thought about that night 1 year ago, when she'd watched her world burn to ashes, about how endings sometimes held the seeds of greater beginnings if you were brave enough to plant them. "Together," she said, taking his hand, "like everything else." The bell's clear voice rang out across the prairie, carrying with it the sound of triumph over tragedy, of love stronger than loss, of hope built one careful stone at a time. And in its echo, Sarah heard not just what had been, but what was yet to come, an endless circle of building, learning, growing, and beginning again. On warm evenings, when prairie winds carried the scent of wildflowers through open windows, Sarah and Jackson Rhodes can often be found on their front porch, sharing the quiet moments between day's work and night's rest. She might be pressing flowers for next term's botany lessons, while he sketches plans for the Academy's continuing expansion. Sometimes they read poetry aloud, their voices mingling with meadowlark song as sunset gilds the world in possibilities. Students still come to them, with dreams and doubts, seeking not just knowledge, but understanding. They find both in the house built from ashes and hope, in Sarah's gentle wisdom and Jackson's quiet strength, in lessons taught by example as much as instruction. The memorial garden blooms now, old schoolhouse bells standing proud among roses, and prairie flowers. Children play there during recess, their laughter rising like prayer while the bell catches sunlight. Its burnt surface a reminder that beauty can survive fire, that endings can become beginnings, that love builds stronger walls than pride. In their private classroom, Sarah's chalkboard still stands where Jackson first placed it. Each morning she writes a new quote for their shared consideration. Today's reads, "In life, as in architecture, strength rises from the firmest foundations." Below it, in Jackson's now precise hand, is added, "And the truest foundations are built by hearts working in harmony." They've learned that some lessons can't be found in books, that the greatest teaching is done by living, that love, like learning, is a continuous process of building, testing, strengthening, and growing, that the most important knowledge is understanding that every day brings new chances to begin again, to build something beautiful, to rise together.